The faculty member that I chose to do my presentation on was Steven Neuberg. So he graduated from Cornell University with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and continued his studies at Carnegie Mellon University and received a Master of Arts in Psychology and a PhD in Social Psychology. He is the chair of the Psychology Department at ASU and a faculty affiliate at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Unit. He has been named fellow multiple times, and some honorable recognitions include the Society of Personal and Social Psychology Student Publication Award, the Gordon Allport Intergroup Relations Prize, which he has earned multiple times, and the Outstanding Doctoral Mentor Award. Some of his research interests include evolutionary approaches to human sociality, stigma, prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination, and much more. The article that I'm going to focus on today is Sexual Prejudice, Avoiding Unwanted Sexual Interest, which was published in the Social, Psychological, and Personality Science Journal, edition 2014, and an additional author is Angela G. Prillo. So the question that we are addressing is, how do heterosexual men and women perceive sexual interest? So the hypothesis was that heterosexuals' prejudice towards non-heterosexuals stems from a desire to avoid persons believed to direct unwanted sexual interest. So some other alternative approaches that may explain this were heterosexuals would view non-heterosexuals favorably, which is the in-group, out-group hypothesis, the gender norm violations hypothesis, which theorizes that sexual prejudices emerge from non-heterosexuals' gender norm violation, and finally, the sexual identity theory hypothesis, which both male and female heterosexuals would feel unfavorably towards same-sex individuals. The predictions that were made were that heterosexual women believe that bisexual men and women and lesbians directed unwanted sexual interest, and heterosexual men believe that bisexual and gay men direct unwanted sexual interest. In addition, heterosexual women will feel negatively toward bisexual men and women and lesbians, whereas heterosexual men will feel negatively toward bisexual and gay men. So developmentally, it is likely that a non-heterosexual realizes their sexual identity from a heterosexual. So for example, in middle school, a heterosexual man may be attracted to a non-heterosexual man may be attracted to a heterosexual man. In addition, prejudice against gay men partially arises from perceptions that they pose disease and child socialization threats. The research objective of this experiment was to quantitatively assess heterosexuals' perceptions of non-heterosexual sexual interest in them. So in study one, heterosexual participants reported their beliefs about 6 target groups: straight men, straight women, bisexual men, bisexual women, gay men, and lesbians on a 9-point scale. And they answered 2 questions: their perceptions of sexual interest or their own sexual interests. Then study 2, using the general feeling thermometer, which is a 9-point scale, 1 being not at all and 9 being extremely, they reported their negativity towards each group. And then in study 3, they repeated the procedures of study 1 and 2, and they were given an additional survey that assessed the violation of gender roles and sexual identity threat. So the results: women believed all targets to be sexually interested in them, with the exception of heterosexual women and gay men. And they were sexually interested in heterosexual men. Men believed all target groups to be sexually interested in heterosexual men, with the exception of heterosexual men, and they were interested in all females. In study 2, heterosexual women had a lack of negativity toward gay men, but an elevated negativity toward bisexual men, and heterosexual men had a lack of negativity for bisexual women. In study 3, we found the same results as study 1 and 2, and in addition, we found that non-heterosexual targets were perceived to violate gender roles more strongly than heterosexual targets, and bisexual women and lesbians were perceived as greater sexual identity threats than gay men, bisexual men, and heterosexual women. Heterosexual men were perceived to threaten sexual identity as much as bisexual women. So in this diagram, we see the discrepancy scores, which are calculated by subtracting the participants' sexual interest from their perceptions about target sexual interest. And it's important to note that the positive scores represent unwanted sexual interest, and the negative scores reflect unreciprocated sexual interest. So, for example, in heterosexual men, homosexual female targets were unreciprocating of sexual interest, but the heterosexual men believed them to be interested in them sexually. So the hypothesis was supported and the alternative hypotheses were rejected. The goal of this experiment was to enhance our understanding of why heterosexuals are prejudiced against sexual orientation, and through such understanding, effective means of understanding this, we can find ways of reducing prejudice